Well, I think he would agree with Emerson. Ralph Waldo Emerson, in his essay on friendship, says the following, and I quote, "In a friend, I'm not looking for a mush of concessions, a person who will agree with everything that I say. Rather, what I'm looking for is a beautiful enemy, a person who will challenge me, a person who will push me, a person who will help me in my apprenticeship to the truth." What a beautiful phrase, a beautiful enemy. Edmund Burke, similar sentiments. "He that wrestles with us strengthens our nerves and sharpens our skill. Our antagonist is our helper." A beautiful enemy. On the one hand, it's an enemy. It's someone who's tough, who's rough, who's demanding. On the other hand, it's beautiful, soft, nice. Ask yourselves, what kind of friend would you like? A mush of concessions, someone who's just nice to you, who says yes to everything that you do, never challenges you, or someone who's honest and open with you? Almost a rhetorical question. We all want someone who will tell us how wonderful we are no matter what. No. We want someone who will challenge us. Especially in leadership, that's critical. Warren Bennis: "Nothing will sink a leader faster than surrounding him or herself with yes men and women. Even when principled naysayers are wrong, they force leaders to reevaluate their positions and to poke and prod their assumptions for weaknesses. Good ideas are only made stronger by being challenged." This is the number one cause of failure of great leaders. Remember I talked about the success-induced blindness? Leaders believe they're so good after they have succeeded. They already don't listen. They shut down naysayers. They only want people who will massage their egos. Feels great, wonderful. Unhealthy for a leader. Extremely unhealthy. The downfall of most leaders is this. As we'll see in a minute, it's easier said than done to be a leader who truly solicits help and responses. It's critical to have beautiful enemies. The best organizations in the world have it. Lou Gessner, initially of McKinsey, later CEO of IBM. McKinsey had a culture that fostered rigorous debate over the right answer, without that debate resulting in personal criticism. We'll talk a lot about how do you give feedback. Just this morning we were talking in the TF meeting, so Jan was making the distinction between feedback and criticism. Criticism is about just me criticizing someone and just wanting to get something off my chest. Whereas feedback is about me giving someone something that they can use. Or the words that we'll use in this class rather than feedback, words that Marshall Goldsmith, who's an executive coach, uses, is feed forward. Rather than feedback, feed forward. Why? Because we are giving people ideas of, here is how you can improve so that you can move forward even better. That's critical to create an environment, and it will be critical in your groups to do that. How do you give good feed forward to people? How do you solicit good feed forward from others so that you can improve as a leader, as a person? Ron Heifetz: "The real heroism of leadership involves having the courage to face reality and helping the people around you to face reality." Jack Welch from General Electric had a mantra: make it real. It has to be real. Good news, bad news, I don't care. Make it real. Easier said than done. I don't think there is one person in the room here who wouldn't agree with the fact that we need beautiful enemies, both on the personal level and organizational level. The question is, though, how many people really are beautiful enemies to others and solicit or are truly open to beautiful enemies? So challenging and being challenged. Not many, research tells us. Chris Argyris, a professor emeritus at the business school and the ed school, joint appointment, did research where he distinguished between in-use theory and espouse theory. And here is what he wrote. Espouse theories of action are those that people report as a basis for actions. This is what people say. This is how we behave. Theories in use are the theories of action inferred from how people actually behave. This is what they actually do. And what he found was that there was a disconnect. They were not always the same. So on the one hand, they would say, yeah, I want to be a beautiful enemy. Yeah, I need beautiful enemies. But on the other hand, they don't behave that way in practice. You know why? Because he continues, most individuals studied seem to be able to detect the discrepancies between their espoused theories and theories in use of others, but we're not able to detect similar discrepancies in themselves. We're blind. Success-induced blindness, well, it's another form of blindness. We're blinded by what we do. Too close. We can't see it. So even though I say, yes, I want to be a beautiful enemy, I believe in it, I am a beautiful enemy, actually I'm not. In many cases, it's not. It's not always the case. Or if I say, I really want to get feedback and to be challenged, in practice, I push away, consciously or subconsciously, people who come and challenge me. There is a real challenge to challenging. It's not easy. Again, in theory, we all say it's important. But in practice, very few of us are really beautiful enemies. Harry Truman, it takes one kind of courage to face a duelist, but it's nothing like the courage it takes to tell a friend no. He said this of his personal hero, Jackson, who could tell a friend no, who could be a beautiful enemy to other people. There's also a story that Nancy Reagan tells in her memoir, where when her husband was the president, the vice president, George Bush Sr., came to her and said, Nancy, you have to go talk to your husband about the White House chief of staff. They were having problems with him. To which she said, well, why don't you go and talk to him? He said, no, it's not my role to talk to him about this. And she responded, this is exactly your role. And she was exactly right. A president doesn't need yaysayers. A president needs beautiful enemies. A president or a teacher or a department head or whomever. But it's not easy. There's a story about Nikita Khrushchev. Nikita Khrushchev was the Communist Party leader in the 1950s. And Nikita Khrushchev came to visit the U.S. as a gesture of goodwill. The Communist Party leader comes to visit the U.S. And after his visit with the president, he took questions at the Washington Press Club, D.C. And he took written questions. And this was the first question. Mr. Khrushchev, today you talked about the hideous rule of your predecessor, Stalin. You were one of his closest aides and colleagues during those years. What were you doing all that time? You were one of his closest aides and colleagues during those years. What were you doing all that time? Khrushchev's face started to turn red. He looked around and he said, Who asked this? Who asked this? His veins started to come out. Who asked this? Complete silence. That's what I was doing. That's what I was doing. This was not communist Russia. This was in Washington. There was no threat of a gulag. And yet when he asked the person to identify him or herself, when there is a leader standing on stage, complete silence. That was an important lesson for these journalist there. Can you imagine what kind of fear he experienced when there was the threat of a gulag, when Stalin had executed millions of people? Where were you during those years? Where are you now? It's not easy standing up and challenging. It wasn't easy for Rosa Parks to sit down where she sat down. But that's what makes a leader. To be precise, by 2002, there were 177 studies showing this. That the higher you get on the hierarchy in an organization, the less reliable feedback you get. In other words, if this is seniority, this is years of seniority, and this is reliable feedback. This is what the graph looks like. More of a leader you become, the less you hear. Do you realize why it's so important for leaders to create an environment that solicits feedback? Because mostly you won't hear it. And by the way, it applies not just for leaders in multi-million-dollar corporations. It applies to leaders on campus as well. Just as it's not easy to challenge others, it's also not easy to be challenged. Most of us would say, yes, we want to be challenged, we want to hear feedback. But as my friend and colleague, professor at Toronto says, Mike Moldovano, we say we want the truth, what we mean is that we want to be correct. In theory, we say we want the truth. In practice, the way we behave is that we want to be correct. John Can. So to summarize, the leader needs a circle of associates who are willing to be both supportive and critical. Pity the leader caught between unloving critics and uncritical lovers. Leaders need reassurance, but just as important, they need advisors who tell them the truth, gently but candidly.